Hello, welcome again for another video blog. This is the third in a three-part series to answer questions we didn't have time to answer during our webinar, Controlled Temperature Chambers, Qualification, Mapping, and Monitoring. So if you didn't get a chance to see that webinar, we have links below the video to go watch it now, and you also get links to the first Q&A video blogs as well. Let's welcome the presenters today. We have Vaisala's Paul Daniel and also Genesis AEC's Validation Director, Nathan Roman. So welcome, guys. Thank you for coming back to do another Q&A.
No problem. Thank you.
Nice to be back.
Let's get started with question one. So is a loaded mapping test with empty boxes an accurate method of mapping? Paul, you want to take that first?
I think a strategy like that with empty boxes is going to provide the maximum challenge in a unit that cools or heats by airflow or by convection. And it's certainly a lot easier to do than finding placebo products to fill those boxes. But remember, our goal here isn't to provide the maximum challenge, which is to provide a representative or a reasonable challenge. And since there probably will never be a time that a chamber is just filled with empty boxes, this may not be a very good representative test. Personally, I would go ahead and do this, being careful not to overload the unit and affect airflow, and just see what happens. And if your study fails, well, just be prepared to repeat it after putting some actual placebo product in those boxes, as that's a much more likely scenario. It'll be easier to pass with product in the boxes, though a little bit more difficult on your setup. Nate?
Yeah, I agree, Paul. Loaded chamber testing is conducted to provide verification that a system performs per its intended use when operating under routine challenged conditions, and that the unit meets its pre-approved criteria, right? For the loaded study, I would use material that best represents the load, as you said earlier, and what is expected to be stored. If using empty boxes represents the material of contents, then by all means use it to test your load. But for a freezer, cold packs may best represent the stored material. Then you'd load the unit with a specified number of cold packs. But whatever you choose, be sure to document your approach into the protocol, and specifically, I would do that beforehand.
Okay, great. Let's stay with that theme for our next question. What percentage of the shelf space should be occupied for full load scenario in an incubator or refrigerator? And then part two of that question, what type of material should be used for loading?
Okay, the best source for full load limits on a chamber is going to be the manufacturer of the chamber. But you might not be able to get that information from them. Either they won't give it to you or they don't have it. We can infer some of this from the ISPE CTC guide. If you look at the diagrams in the guide, the sensors at the sides and corners are not placed in the absolute corners, but they're placed at the edge of what's called the working area. And these ISP placements are based on an older French norm. And in that document, they define that distance, the working area, and they say, move those sensors in 10% of the dimension of the unit. So if you had a controlled temperature chamber that was a perfect cubic meter, a perfect square 1 meter on a side, we would move the sensors in 10 centimeters. So now your working area is only going to be an area that's 80 centimeters square. So if you do the math, that's only about 51% of the total volume that you would have gotten in that cubic meter space, right? Because we're now allowing space on the sides for airflow. Now you may be able to get information like this from the owner of the incubator refrigerator. Sometimes they'll include load limits in their SOPs. And of course, depending on the type of unit, airflow might not matter at all. In a ultra low freezer, that relies on conduction, not airflow to cool the space and keep it frozen. So usually those kinds of units you can pack pretty full. The challenge with those is not to pack them so full that you can't find what you're looking for. But for a good rule of thumb, on a typical refrigerator incubator that cools by convection, by airflow, I would not go over 50% for a full load.
Okay. So let's give this next one to Nathan. What is acceptable acceptance criteria for power outage tests?
From my perspective, temperature mapping is a way to validate and document that a temperature controlled space is suitable for its intended purpose, right? So it's my experience that the power outage testing or power failure testing is performed to determine the time it takes for the temperature to exceed the specifications in case the power is lost. If power is lost, would you like to know how long the temperature in your chamber remains within limits? In order to provide that information, we have to close the doors and switch off the power and do a temperature map. The purpose of that test is to find out how long the materials are safe inside the space over once the power fails. That study in the IOQ is typically for information only throughout all the years that I've been doing temperature mapping. So there's no real requirement to include it in your qualifications. However, the test data can be used to evaluate the potential impact of temperature excursions occurring during routine use. It can also help to write in an SOP, standard operating procedure, for the actions to be taken in case there is a power failure. As for acceptance criteria, the equipment should be powered down successfully, and when power is restored, the equipment needs to recover from the power loss and return to within the process range that's required, your operating parameters. In addition, verify that the operating set point and alarm set points remain programmed when the power is restored to the system.
And I hadn't thought about that, verifying a correct reboot. That does seem to be important, Nate. But in general, I don't like power outage tests, and I don't really consider them to be validation. But I'm a bit of a purist there. Acceptance criteria need to come from somewhere. We can't just make them up. And if you don't have acceptance criteria, it isn't validation. So where do we get acceptance criteria for this? The vendor of the CTC, they're not going to give it to us. And usually when these studies get done, it just says perform the test and see how long the temperatures stay in specification. And then, like you said, Nate, we keep this data on file to evaluate future situations where power is lost. You might have situations where a validation department has put in a policy that they want to see that temperatures stay good for 10 minutes, for 15 minutes with the power off. But that's really the only place I can think of where you're going to get an acceptance criteria for a power failure test. And that's because these tests are about gathering information, not about meeting acceptance criteria. And that's why I don't like calling them validation. But if you are going to do these tests, obviously the best time to do them is when you're doing a temperature mapping.
Great. Let's call that part 3 of our Q&A from our webinar. And thank you again for joining us, Nathan and Paul. And thank you to everybody who joined us on the webinar. You were very interactive, sending questions, and we were really grateful. We've gone through all the questions. If you didn't receive that document in your follow-up email, just email me or Paul, and we'll happily send you that document. So thank you for joining us, and we'll see you again in a future webinar.